Our guest is David K. Johnston, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist, has written the book Free Lunch: How the Wealthiest Americans Enrich Themselves at Government Expense and Stick You with the Bill. Juan?
Well, David K. Johnston, the American home, subprime crisis has been much in the news, and the enormous impact it's having on the economy. You've got a few chapters here where you talk about the home and home robbery, and you even delve on an issue that very few people have ever talked about: title insurance companies and the enormous wealth transfers that have gone on there. Could you talk about that?
Oh, sure. You know, when you buy a home, and I remember the first time I did it as a young man, you have this enormous sense of accomplishment. And you sit down in a room and they throw all these papers at you. Sign this, initial this page. Okay, sign this. So when you're all done, you get a little sheet listing all the costs you have. And you get dinged for $15 here and $25 there. But there's one big item called land title insurance. If you buy a $200,000 house, it'll probably cost you close to $1,000. Well, it turns out that 90 cents out of every dollar you are forced to pay for this goes to pay commercial bribes. And this goes on all throughout the industry, all across the United States, and nobody's prosecuted for it. And here's what happens. While you wrote the check for the $1,000, the land title insurance companies, who are insuring the risk that someone will come along and say, that's really my piece of land, or I have the right to put an oil well in your backyard, here's this document from 1848, or your new outbuilding encroaches 1 inch onto the neighbor's land, supposedly. That's what you're insuring against. These companies' real customers are the real estate agent that you thought was representing you, or the lawyer you paid to represent you, or the mortgage broker who arranged to get you the mortgage, because they steer you to the title company, and in return they get kickbacks. The state insurance commissioners of California and Washington wrote very detailed reports about this, because one of the land title companies tried to smear the insurance commissioner of Colorado. And there's emails and tape record conversations about a very Machiavellian plot to use the news media to plant a question that would smear this woman. What did the insurance commissioner say should be done after they found that 90% of this money is paid in kickbacks? And by the way, one of the big title companies in its report to shareholders says that its customers aren't you and me when we buy a house. It says its customers are the bankers and the brokers and the lawyers. Well, the insurance commissioner said what we need is an education program. We need to make sure that the land title companies know that they can't pay these kickbacks and referral fees, as they're politely called. Well, if the education program worked, the cost of land title insurance would have dropped 90%. It hasn't. So it's another example of the kind of institutionalized corruption that I write about in Free Lunch, that takes money from the many and concentrates it in the hands of the politically connected few.
I wanted to ask you about Barack Obama's comments, David K. Johnston, who praised... Well, one thing,
Amy, I don't talk about the presidential campaign.
Oh, you don't have to. You don't have to
okay.
talk about them, but just the substance of what he had to say, which was very interesting, as he talked about former President Ronald Reagan. He was in an interview with the Reno Gazette-Journal, appearing to express admiration for what he called Reagan's clarity and optimism in overcoming excesses of the 60s and 70s. This is what he said.
I think Ronald Reagan changed the trajectory of America in a way that, Richard Nixon did not, and in a way that Bill Clinton did not. He put us on a fundamentally different path because the country was ready for it. I think they felt like, with all the excesses of the 60s and the 70s, and government had grown and grown, but there wasn't much sense of accountability in terms of how it was operating. And I think people just tapped in. He tapped into what people were already feeling, which is we want clarity, we want optimism, we want a return to that sense of dynamism and entrepreneurship that had been missing.
In response, rival candidate John Edwards said Reagan did extraordinary damage to the middle class and working people, created a tax structure that favored the very wealthiest Americans, caused the middle class and working people to struggle every single day. He said, I can promise you I'll never use Ronald Reagan as an example for change. So David K. Johnston, without getting into presidential politics, you write extensively about Ronald Reagan in this book.
Yes. Well, Ronald Reagan, whether you love Ronald Reagan or you hate Ronald Reagan, was a great leader. He did, in fact, dramatically change the country. Between 1945 and the election of Ronald Reagan, we had a government that was focused on creating and nurturing the middle class. When I was a young man, I was able to go to college only because it was free. Didn't matter that I didn't have any money. My dad was a 100% disabled veteran, and I went to work when I was 10 years old and full-time since I was 13 because it was free. Today, the cost of a college education, a state college education, is about $10,000 a year. The average income of the bottom half of taxpayers, that's not families, that's taxpayers, is about $15,000. I think you can go to college if 2/3 of your income would have to go to college. I don't think so. Well, what Mr. Reagan did in 1980 was he asked a question that had a very powerful effect. He said, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And Americans said no, they weren't. And they elected him to office, and they set in motion a major change in government policy, a change that I think has been perverted. I do not believe Reagan intended all of the things that have been done since he started this happening. But I'm asking the question in free lunch, are you better off than you were in 1980? And on the surface, America is much better off. The country is more than twice as wealthy in real terms as it was in 1980. Per person, adjusted for inflation, the economy now puts out $1.70 for every dollar that it put out in 1980. Those are absolutely tremendous economic numbers. So how come we're not all really well off? Why is it 1 in 7 families has filed bankruptcy in the last 25 years? Why is it people are so mired in debt that television ads are just full of debt relief and take on more debt ads, sometimes at 99% interest? Why is it that so many people don't have health insurance and so many people no longer have a retirement plan? And by the way, the average income of the bottom 90% of Americans, what I call the vast majority, is smaller today than it was in 1980. And since the year 2000, when we really got serious about this tax cut business, the average income of Americans every year, 2001, 2, 3, 4, 5, has been smaller than it was in 2000. There have been some gains in 2004 and 5, but they haven't gotten up to equal 2000. And of those gains in the year 2000, it's either 5 over 4 or 4 over 3, half went to people who make over $1 million a year.
Didn't that wealth transfer massively begin, accelerate with Reagan?
Oh, yes. No, that's exactly my point, Amy, is that what happened is that we put in place all sorts of new programs, and many of which were never written about in the news media, that got no attention whatsoever. We created healthcare billionaires while making healthcare unavailable to 1 in 7 Americans. We did this with government money. We allowed people to buy public assets for, in some cases, a fraction of a penny on the dollar, and then poured government money into them. And our national myth that Ronald Reagan ran for office on was that there were all these welfare queens driving Cadillacs out there. I think there was, in fact, one scam artist who went to prison. But what's really going on is welfare at the top, and way beyond what's been reported in the news media is corporate welfare. We have built into the scaffolding of the new economy rules that funnel money to the top. And that this has happened really shouldn't surprise us, because under our campaign finance system, which has gotten worse and worse and worse with campaign finance reform that hasn't worked, politicians running for high office spend a great deal of their time talking not to you and me and school teachers and police officers and firefighters and factory workers, but to rich people and their paid representatives, and they hear about their concerns and what they say they need to make things fair.